I'm Jim Czek. You're watching Kelowna Now. I have with me Renee Merrifield, and also on the line, all the way from Vancouver, I take it, Mario Canseco, and the pollster, and the big day coming up November 5th, and it's a huge day.
Huge day.
It's
And
gonna be a big one, yeah.
and what are we looking at? Like what you've done some polls. What do the numbers tell you?
I think there's a couple of things that really are different this time around, especially when you look at the nationwide numbers. We've grown accustomed to the idea of the Donald Trump voter being very extreme, very upset, older, and what we're seeing is the 18 to 34 crowd really reacting to what Donald Trump is saying. So that has been a major revelation in the data. In 2016, it was very hard to find young Americans who were willing to vote for Donald Trump. And now, in some cases, they're a larger number than those who are voting for Kamala Harris. Now, that is different also when you look at the level of support for the Democrats. The intensity from women when it comes to Kamala Harris's candidacy is significantly higher than what we saw in 2016 for Hillary Clinton. So it's an interesting case of essentially 47-48% of people really dead set on who they're going to be voting for. This suggests, because of the sheer size of some of the states that are going to be won by Kamala Harris, that she'll lead in the popular vote. But of course, what matters is the Electoral College, and that is where we're having a significantly harder time trying to figure out who's going to win some states.
Well, and that's a really interesting point that you make, Mario, because you're right. A lot of people look to the popular vote, but similar to, let's say, our provincial elections, when you can look to a popular vote, but it really depends on how many seats you get in terms of the MLAs and the electoral districts. It's similar in the U.S. in that the popular vote could go one way or the other, but really it's those electoral districts that are going to make a difference. And what we saw in a number of different years is that those swings were quite big on election night. The predictions were, very tight in terms of 2%, 3%, but then on election night, you'd see the real swing in those seats. Do you think that that's going to be the same?
I think, there's a couple of things that are different this time around. Ohio, for instance, is essentially a red state now. And we can go back to 2004 when it was the last state to be called. You didn't know if John Kerry was going to win it. Now it looks more like one of the southern states. It's going to be more the size of the margin of victory for Donald Trump. Florida is a similar situation. Back in 2012, it was very close between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, and now Trump is probably going to run away with it by 4 or 5 points. I think part of the essence here is going to come down to Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. We were in field in early October. The differences were between 1 or 2 points for each of the candidates. And the other two states that are going to be interesting to watch are Arizona and North Carolina. In Arizona, the senatorial candidate, Kari Lake, has been tanking. She's really dropped in support for the past month. And that could mean that maybe people are thinking about it twice when it comes to the Republicans in the White House. And in North Carolina, the scandals related to gubernatorial candidate Mark Robinson can actually mean that the voter turnout from Republicans is a little bit lower. So it could actually mean good news for the Democrats. But I think it all hinges on those 3 states that in 2016 the Democrats took for granted and lost to Donald Trump.
They spent a lot of time in Pennsylvania, including recruiting Elon Musk and the likes of that. And where do you see Pennsylvania right now?
It's essentially a statistical tie. I think it's going to be crucial to figure out what happens with independent voters, because one of the things that has been remarkable about this particular election is the level of undecideds has been very low throughout. And it's understandable. You know who Donald Trump is. You know who Kamala Harris is. It's not the same situation that we had in 2020 when people were sort of on the fence. You're assessing the government of Trump versus what could happen under Joe Biden. But independent voters are still sort of on the fence. We still had about 15 to 17% of independent voters, both in the state polls and in the national one, who said, I haven't made up my mind yet. And these are the people who decide elections. So, whatever happens, especially in some of the rural areas, I think, when we start counting the ballots, for instance, Michigan always starts counting with Cook County, which is where Detroit is, and you're going to see the numbers for Kamala Harris at 80%. That's that's what you get when you are very popular in the urban areas. But once you start counting some of the other counties, it could be significantly closer.
Yeah, interesting story that's been running on some of the social media is the bakery that's in Pennsylvania that does the poll every single year of who buys which cookie. And so it's this little cute bakery that's been doing this since 2008, and they have predicted 3 of the 4 last elections accurately. So right now, Trump is leading 12,558 cookies to Harris's 889.
Wow.
So if it's any indication, that's a pretty big landslide. But I think that, I'm using this story and obviously very anecdotal and very, very sweet. But on the other case, I think it's that difficult to predict. I think that people are looking at all sorts of different types of methodology to figure out where the swing is actually going to go. And I mean, the swings are the two candidates are campaigning on very different things, very different items. I know that there's going to be a lot written about these candidates and their campaigns. I mean, anytime you can go into a McDonald's in a garbage truck and actually be campaigning is pretty exceptional. But the speed at which they are responding to each other's campaigns is actually quite remarkable. And obviously shows the amount of money that they have running through these two different campaigns. But when I look at what it means for Canada, these two candidates are going to make very different decisions and will have very different influences on Canada. You look at Harris and you think, well, she lived in Montreal for a time, so maybe she'll be more affectionate towards Canada. She won't be as harsh maybe as what Trump will be. But both of them are fairly protectionistic. But she's not talking about tariffs. And Trump is talking tariffs in the 18 to 20% range immediately. I mean, that could happen in his first 90 days in office. And then you've got, maybe Harris is a little bit more of a known entity and maybe she'll, carry on with more of the same. Whereas Trump's talking everything from immigration, do immigrants flood our border, or reproductive rights? Does suddenly medical tourism become something that is a necessity for women in trouble in the U.S. So, I mean, there's some really interesting dynamics between these two candidates. And I know that it's not just Canada because we are so somewhat relatively insignificant for the U.S., but it's the rest of the world too that's looking at the same sort of implications of these two different candidates. Do you think that the global aspect factors in at all? Or do you think that because most Americans don't even have a passport and haven't traveled outside of its borders, do you think it really doesn't matter to the U.S. voter as much as what we would think it would?
It's a very interesting catch-22 in that sense, because there's always this discussion of we're the beacon of light for the world, we're the most important country, we're the ones who support everybody else when the Russians get nasty or when something needs to be done. But it's that same crowd that goes, don't mess with us. We are going to make our decision, and if this is the Republican candidate and I'm a Republican, I'm going to stay with this particular candidate. You're right about the implications for Canada. I think we were just in field asking Canadians who they would prefer to be in the White House, and obviously, Kamala Harris wins handily. But I think people, especially those who are particularly distrustful of Donald Trump, gravitate towards the Democrats. But the Democrats have traditionally been more protectionist when it comes to jobs, when it comes to NAFTA, when it comes to free trade, than the Republicans. And there's a little bit of a glimmer of hope for the environmental crowd if Kamala Harris gets in, and we'll discuss things in a different fashion. There's also the implications for the country. I mean, if Donald Trump wins, how does that affect the next federal election? What is going to happen? How is Justin Trudeau going to campaign now that he has once again to deal with Donald Trump? Or if Kamala Harris wins, is it going to be easier for Pierre Poilievre to say, vote for me? We can certainly do things differently.
Do you think if Trump wins that they look back on it and say they should have put Kamala Harris in front of the microphone sooner? Because she seems to be getting better as it moves along, but she was reluctant to speak in the beginning. But now she seems to find her mojo. You see her at rallies. She's starting to take questions. But I think, she seemed to have started late out of the gate for that.
I think there's a couple of issues. One of them is it's very difficult to recreate the Obama magic in that sense. We had a lot of people who supported Hillary Clinton, in the primaries back in 2008, and they said, okay, I get what this is about. This person is speaking to me, and I think this is important. That is happening more with women, but not necessarily with younger voters. I think that has been the major issue. Obama connected very well. They had a campaign that was focusing on the university towns. I mean, my favorite story from 2008 is an African-American man winning Indiana in the Electoral College, which is incredible when you think about the history of Indiana, the fact that they had at one point the largest number of members in the KKK in the 20th century. But that's what happens when you knock on doors, when you go to the university towns and essentially entice young people to say this is going to be different for you. I'm not seeing the same type of emotional connection from the young crowd with Kamala Harris. And that is also problematic. But I think you're right. Part of it is she was very constrained in the early stages of the campaign, and it might be too late now to connect with those voters.
Do you think missing the Joe Rogan podcast is a bad thing too? Because he's the most popular podcaster out there, and he connects with a really young to middle-aged audience. Like, he's very, very popular.
Especially male.
Yeah.
Especially male, and that is part of it. There's probably no need to connect with young women. They're already there. They're supportive of you. They want to see somebody of their own gender becoming president. They're also worried about the Roe v. Wade implications. I mean, you could name a thousand things that would make young women more supportive, but it's the young men that are right now struggling, that are looking at this as maybe Trump is going to have the answer to the housing crisis. Maybe Trump is going to have the answer to something different. Joe Biden spent a lot of the last couple of years talking about billions of this and millions of that. That doesn't resonate with somebody who's still living in their basement. And that is part of the complexity that Kamala Harris needs to deal with. And I think you need to reach that broader audience. I don't think if you're running for office, you should pick and choose which establishments or which podcasts or which media outlets you want to talk to. Everybody is going to be able to connect, and if you're properly prepared to deal with the questions that are going to be thrown at you, it actually makes you stronger.
Yeah. You mentioned the Obama campaign. I mean, that campaign started so grassroots, and he was really one of the first ones to do the $5 and $10 donation. And he didn't rely on those big corporations to the same extent. And I still remember watching the Democratic convention with his first real speech. And that was before he had ever had any, presidential aspirations. And I remember thinking, he's going to be president one day. Like, just his demeanor, his hope, his message, he had that aspect incredibly well put together. But a lot of that came from these small groups, small gatherings, town hall style, question and answer. That relatability was really there. And Kamala has not had that same opportunity. She started really in a political position, as it were, as the Attorney General over in California, and really she has not a Crown Prosecutor. I'm glitching on her
State
title.
Prosecutor,
Forgive me. But at any rate, she hasn't had that real grassroots movement that's necessary, and that's evident in who's voting for her and who's not voting for her.
Part of this, in my mind, has to do with the absence of a primary. People look at the absence of a primary that features Kamala Harris as, this is rigged and this is terrible. None of this would be happening if Joe Biden doesn't agree to a debate with Donald Trump in April, because that was the moment when everybody realized, okay, we're not going to win this thing. But, not having primaries essentially does not allow you to connect with voters in a more meaningful way. This is essentially, we don't want Donald Trump. This is the person we have. And, you have a couple of months to get to know this person. And it's just not enough time. I think part of why the race is so close at this stage is that you couldn't have that ability for the Democratic voter to get to know Kamala Harris. And sometimes you run out of time in the campaigns. And this might be part of it. If they had a larger runway, it would have been a lot easier to try to establish that own personality, because what we have right now is a significant proportion of Democrats who say, I'll vote Democratic regardless of who it is, or I'm so afraid of Donald Trump that I'll vote Democratic regardless of who it is. But it's not similar to what we saw back in 2008 when people were essentially saying, I like Obama, I think he should be next in line.
Yeah. What do you think of the running mate selections? To me, it seems like J.D. Vance is the best orator of the bunch. He's got the most depth of knowledge. He could speak very well. I think of the four, he's the strongest orator, and he gets his point across. Like Obama was a great orator. Like he was charismatic and he was all those things. But J.D. Vance seems to think on his feet really, really well, knows the issues. How much of an effect does the VP play in this election?
Usually you look for somebody who will help you carry a state. And, we go back to John Kerry picking John Edwards. Maybe we'll get North Carolina. They didn't. J.D. Vance is from Ohio. It's a state that is right now solidly red. So to me, it was a bit of a dumbfounding selection. But, you need somebody who's younger. You need somebody who's going to think on their feet. You want to appeal to that younger crowd that is looking at the Republicans as an option. So in that sense, I thought it was a good idea. I frankly expected Kamala Harris to go with Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, because that is a much more important state than Minnesota. And she went with Tim Walz. And I think that's something that we're going to find out, not probably Tuesday night, but Wednesday or Thursday when all of the mail-in ballots have been counted. But it's been a different situation as far as what you're thinking about when it comes to your running mates. I think both campaigns essentially forgot the golden rule, which is get somebody who's going to help you carry a state that you can't carry on your own. And that got thrown out the window by the Republicans when they chose Sarah Palin to be John McCain's running mate. But in other elections, they've been very careful about this, except Joe Biden, because they needed to find somebody who was young and a woman. And it's not like California was ever in doubt. But that is part of the decision-making process that has us here.
The Republicans are stating that they have the big tent with Tulsi Gabbard and RFK. How much influence do those two Democrats, or one's a former Democrat now, she's now switched to the Republican Party, do they play in this election?
The whole Robert Kennedy Jr. thing, the dream scenario, and this has some echoes to the BC provincial election in a way, because, the idea was, okay, if we can keep BC united and the BC conservatives cannibalizing each other, the NDP will win a significant majority. And of course, that didn't happen in the end. But I see some similarities because the Democrats were looking at the numbers that Robert Kennedy Jr. was getting in specific states, particularly Texas, and said all of the votes for Kennedy are coming out of the Trump pile. So if Kennedy stays in the race, we could win Texas, which hasn't happened in decades. And Texas is the second biggest prize after California. So you're thinking about it going, it's in our best interest to keep Robert Kennedy in the race. And then Robert Kennedy exits the race. So I think it's more the influence that he could have had as a candidate than what happens afterwards. And it's not as if people are going to be upset by thinking, Robert Kennedy has made some pretty controversial remarks, and he might be in charge of a specific agency under a Donald Trump government. I don't think that's going to move people necessarily, but it's the absence on the ballot that changes things. I remember people thinking Kanye West on the ballot. Kanye West is not going to have an effect in 2020 and didn't. But Kennedy's a completely different situation because he was bringing in a lot of voters who were thinking about casting a ballot for the Republicans and said, maybe this is the right course of action.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point, Mario, that, that does parallel somewhat, what happened here in BC. And also that, what happened after that, split was no longer there is similar to what's happened in the Harris camp. Eby was really on his heels because he was actually, believing that he would be able to utilize that split to his advantage and really villainize, the two different camps and let them fight it out and really do damage to one another. And when that suddenly was gone, he didn't know how to fight. He didn't have the campaign. And, at one point I was watching the news and I said, man, he's advertising more for the conservatives than he is for his own record. And I'm finding that now, again, emulated with the Harris campaign. Without Robert Kennedy out there as the independent, again, they kind of thought they do get out and come through the middle. And instead, they're having to do a lot more of a sophisticated campaign. And I have to hand it to the Trump campaign right now. He's taken the juice out of everything that they're throwing at it, and in a very remarkably fast way, and really on their heels. But having said that, I would say the other aspect of the Harris campaign is that, Trump thought he was going to go up against Biden. And when that switch was done in April, to some extent, it was masterful in that the Trump campaign didn't have time to really adjust, and he's struggling. And I think that the flood of women going to the Harris campaign is case in point. His only defense not only, but one of his strong defenses, against Harris is that, like, oh, she's a dumb woman. Well, that's not going to bode very well for a lot of the women and female voting population that's out there. And so I do think that there's some really significant late coming dynamics that have made this a very interesting race.
Well, I think you're absolutely right on the way in which the campaign developed, almost in the same fashion as the first couple of weeks of the BC campaign. You had one camp essentially saying, be careful because we can't let this guy in. And the other camp saying, I'll solve all your problems if you let me get in. And it's been playing out the same way it played out the first couple of weeks of the BC campaign. This is what we're seeing on the final couple of weeks in the United States. Watch out, this is terrible. This guy's a tyrant and he's going to destroy everything. And on the other side, you're hearing this idea of, is your life better? Wasn't it better before we did this? And of course, we had the pandemic and it was difficult, but this is the moment to shift gears and to send me back. And elections are won on emotions, right? And fear is an emotion, and that could play a role in the way people decide to cast their ballots, particularly those independents who don't know where to go to. But it certainly hasn't been, to borrow Sarah Palin's terms, a hopey, changey campaign, right? It's been more than anything. It's been, watch out, we don't want this guy in, and the other guy saying, they're terrible, and once you send me back, everything's going to be back to normal, and we'll all be, great again, or whatever. So it's been very difficult because you might assume that this is the kind of thing that can turn voters off. I don't want anything to do with these people. But we haven't seen the numbers climbing for the third party candidates. The Green, the Libertarian, Dr. West. Of course, RFK is out of it now. But usually what happens when people are thrown off is, okay, I'm just going to vote for a third party candidate out of spite. And I doubt that they'll get to 1.5 or 2% of the vote.
They've left them on a couple of ballots in a couple of states. Where do you think who does that hurt then? Does that hurt the Democrats or the Republicans?
I think it hurts the Republicans more. Yeah. And because all the research that was done before suggested that, he was getting a larger chunk of the Republicans and than the Democrats. People assume, it's a Kennedy. You could run a Kennedy as a Democrat anywhere, even if it's a scarecrow with a suit, and they'll get 75% of the vote from Democrats. That really wasn't the case. People were more likely to be looking at it as, I'm already on the side of the fence that goes tear it all apart. This is the guy to tear it all apart. And that really freaked out the Republicans. They weren't expecting that type of thing. And this is why you had those moments when they coalesced with each other and decided to do things differently. It happened at a significantly slower pace than what we saw with BC United and the BC Conservatives, but it was a similar situation.
We've seen in BC, both Eby and Rustad promise a lot of candy if they were going to win. And we're also seeing that with Donald Trump, like he's throwing out trillions of dollars in vote buying. And he's made some dramatic promises to end a war before he even takes office, the day that he wins the election, supposedly. So he's made some really big promises, and I guess Renee could tell us more. So what does a Trump victory mean to British Columbia? Because that's our biggest trading partner, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Trump is very protectionistic. He makes no bones about it. He wants to make sure that the United States and United States companies are firing on all cylinders and doing really well. He wants their economy to be thriving. And for their economy to thrive, it really means that they want less importing. They want to really rely on their own businesses, their own product. And, that was interesting even through the Obama era. Obama, when he came to Vancouver, he actually said, make no mistake, we are an oil and gas producer, and we've, doubled our production under, my 8 years in office. And that used to be more of a Democratic play. Now we're seeing it with Trump in the last 4 years, and he's promising it again. His first 90 days, he's promising to introduce tariffs that will, be slapped all over, BC and Canadian goods. That's going to hurt everything from our lumber industry to, to our exports of gas and oil.
The pipeline.
Yeah.
Did Biden scrap the Keystone Pipeline?
But Trump did not bring it back.
No, but I'm just saying, like, he scrapped it the first day in his office. So Trump, do you think he'll bring it back?
No.
No?
Yeah, that one's tough. And the other thing to remember, and it's been so long that many of us forgot about this, the USMCA is up for review. Yeah. Do you want that to be reviewed under a Trump presidency? Buckle up, because it's going to be complicated. Or how does a Kamala Harris administration deal with something like this? And you have a new partner in Mexico, albeit it's essentially a continuation of the previous government, which is more center-left minded, but it won in a landslide in a year where most governments have been punished at the ballot box.
Well, and you look at what Mexico has done over the course of the last 4 years with their, trans-Mexican rail line. I watched with great intrigue as they, from Tulum over onto the West Coast, basically created the fastest way to move goods for the southern, southeast U.S. across, faster than through the Panama Canal. So you're looking at a tremendous trade route that the U.S. can really capitalize on. And, Mario, I love that you said the USMCA, because literally Mexico benefited from that agreement far more than what Canada did, despite the fact that U.S. did more trading with Canada at that time than they did with Mexico. But it was far more favorable to Mexico. There were the closed-door meetings that Canada wasn't invited to. And my fear is that would continue under a Trump administration. And Mario, I do think that concern is very real. Now, I mean, Kamala, will she be any better to Canada under that? Maybe. And that's where she did live in Canada for a while. So maybe she has more of a fondness for the Canadian government and the Canadian plight. But really, I mean, both of these presidents would be incredibly protectionistic when it comes to really guarding their own economy and making sure that they come out ahead, regardless of who plays with them in the sandbox.
And then the Trudeau Trump relationship, not very good, because obviously Trudeau has attacked Trump many times. I wouldn't think that they might even look for reasons to pick on Canada until maybe there was a Poilievre government or something. What would you say of how the Trudeau factor plays into this?
I think that's an extreme possibility. I mean, I think the dream scenario, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but for the Liberals would be a Trump victory. And then you can galvanize the forces and say, we need somebody with experience because Donald Trump is down there, and you don't want to have Pierre Poilievre, who's untested, who hasn't done this, who's probably not ready to do somebody like this, and who would essentially do whatever Donald Trump wants to do. I'm not suggesting it's a winning strategy, but it's something that they're going to be talking about at length. Whereas if it's Kamala Harris, you're going to try to turn it into, let's keep this. We worked very well with Joe Biden. We were able to get things done. Do you want Pierre Poilievre dealing with Kamala Harris? But we, with the exception of 88, we usually don't fight elections federally based on foreign policy. So people are going to be more upset with the things that are making them vote against incumbent governments: housing, homelessness, poverty, healthcare, the economy, and jobs. I don't think people are going to say foreign policy. Immigration might play a role, and I think that is going to be something to watch in the next few months, because we've seen it climbing, not at the level that we see some of the other issues, but now you have your good 6, 8, 10% of Canadians who say the number one issue for me is that there's too many of us here already.
So we're gonna have to wrap this up. Renee's got another appointment she's got to make it to. But what do we watch for on election night? What's the pattern we're gonna watch for? And then we'll end it with that.
The pattern is going to be the popular vote is probably going to be close because California doesn't count everything until a couple of weeks later. But, we start with Kentucky, which is going to be solidly Republican, move our way to the West. There's a couple of issues at play. Georgia is notoriously slow for counting, so we might not know who wins Georgia for a couple of days. Similar situation in Arizona. Pennsylvania, we had the situation in 2020 where we went to bed with Donald Trump ahead by a couple of votes, and we woke up with Joe Biden in first place after all the mail-in ballots. There's a complexity here because the Republicans this year were told to vote by mail, and it wasn't the case back in 2020. It was always, cast your vote, cast your vote. I think they were worried about the fact that they were losing those early counts. So we can no longer look at the vote without the mail-in ballots and assume that all of those ballots that are missing are going to be Democratic. So I don't think we're going to know who wins this thing until later in the week.
Yeah.
Any final words, Renee?
No, just I think that I think that it was interesting even during the provincial election as to how interested Canadians and British Columbians were on the U.S. There's more drama, there's more chaos. It's a little bit more heated. And so it was very interesting to see that most people had more of an awareness of what was happening down in the U.S. than they did even what was happening here in BC. So it'll be interesting to see how many Canadians and how many British Columbians are actually watching on election night and following along as those ballots are counted. Big
bowl of popcorn and your favorite beverage.
Absolutely.
I think in the U.S. they have the Beyoncés and the Elon Musks and the all these big names out there, and I don't know who we had here in BC that were stumping for anybody, but
no one. You know what? That is a huge difference. You actually see, and even some of the agencies or the institutions that I deal with in my private sector life, it's been interesting. I've been getting a vote for Harris or vote for Trump, and here's why, and here's all the rationale, and it's been very interesting just to see all of these very large personalities, influencers, corporations, institutions really coming out for one or the other. Whereas in BC, everyone just kind of cowers and is scared. Outside of the activists, you really don't get a lot of stuff. Yes, other than Chip Wilson.
It's a lot easier for him to do it, right?
Yeah.
And what you need is a billboard.
On his house, yeah.
Anyway, we thank you for your time again, as usual, Mario. And then Renee are going to do a political show, so that's going to be great. And we're definitely going to cover all the federal stuff, and we'd love to have you in on those ones. And we're hoping for spring. You're calling a spring election.
I think it'll happen in the spring. We'll see. Not in the winter because Nova Scotia decided to do this first, but we shall
Renee's
see.
nodding.
It's not in our hands,
I think Mario's right. I think that the Liberals have signaled that because they haven't agreed to any of the concessions that the Bloc put forward. Honestly, they would have bankrupted Canada, so I'm very happy that they didn't do some of those. But I say spring too. My vote's for spring.
I got an email that said the Liberals have picked 2 new campaign managers, so there you go. That must mean something, right?
There we go.
They're all getting ready. Awesome.
Anyway, thank you, and thank you for watching Kelowna Now.
My pleasure.
We don't just report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government funding, no outside influence. Kelowna Now, local, independent.